Plaquemines Parish Council Audit Committee to order at 9:30 a.m. at the Belle Chase Council Building Council Chambers. And the machine is open for roll call. Let the record reflect that all members are present, and Mr. Duke is here representing the Audit Committee Department. And at this time, I'd like to ask you to rise for the Pledge of Allegiance. Repeat after me. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. All right, good morning, and thank you all for being here. We will move to item 2, new business.
Approval of the 2018 to 2019 annual audit plan.
All right, Mr. Duke, you have distributed a schedule of audit priorities for 2019, which overlaps some of your work towards the end of this year, 2018. And if you want to go through that, we can discuss that. Would you speak into the mic a little louder so we could hear?
Here is the schedule of audit priorities for 2018-2019. The reason I say 2018 is because the water department has been started and it won't be finished until 2019.
Okay.
But these, as I stated in that paragraph above, normally how it's worked for me in the past is that these, if you don't finish some of these audits during the year, they get carried forward so that you can take them up during the next year, if the audit committee is okay with that. So what I have now for 2018 and 19, of course, is the water department. I have the grants, and I think that's a good one. The contracts, parish contracts, I think we definitely need to find out what the population is on that, if those contracts are being handled properly. Timekeeping and overtime. Property. I'd like to take a look at all the property and get a good population of what is owned by the parish as well as what's leased out by the parish, and if we're getting the appropriate amount of rental revenue for the properties. Purchasing, disbursements, boat harbors, ambulances, firefighting. That's a good one too. I've had some experience with the Inspector General's office taking a look at the firefighting cost center, and I think we need to check that out here as well. Community Action Agency, definitely want to take a look at what's going on there with the grants. And that's 10 audits, and I left it at 10 rather than 12, just in case the audit committee wants to add a few during 2019.
Okay. So to summarize this up, our proposed internal audits for the remainder of 2018 and 2019 are just as you described: the water department, the grants, the contracts, timekeeping and overtime, purchasing, property leased, boat harbors, ambulance, firefighting, community action agency. And with that, I'll offer the motion to approve the 2018 annual audit plan and ask for a second.
Second.
Seconded by both members. Is there any comments or discussion on the proposed internal audits for the remainder of 2018 and 2019? No. No further comments on it, then the machine is open on the adoption of that plan. And the plan is adopted unanimously 3-0. Move to item B.
Review of the ports contracts and agreements internal audit.
Okay, Mr. Duke has completed the ports contracts and agreement audit. I see Ms. Chambrell is just now entering the chamber representing the port. And at this time, we will go ahead and turn it over to Mr. Duke to discuss this audit. Now, I received this audit a couple of days ago, but I have not had time to review it or look through it. So this will be a first look for me. And what I would like to do is that once we have this presentation from Mr. Duke, that we can decide on the course of action that we move forward on. So I'll turn it over to you, Mr. Duke.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. What we're going to do here today is review the port's contract and agreements internal audit. And what I'd like to do is scroll down here to the executive summary. First of all, what I'd like to do, I'd like to work this, if it's okay with the committee. I'd like to review my conclusions first. And then from there, we can take a look at the observations and conditions. Now, to make this go smoother, I think that what we could do is for me to go through my recommendations with the committee. If the committee would like to have more elaboration, more information on any one of those recommendations, then we can take a look at the detail in the audit. And I think that would speed things up a little bit for us, as well as give us enough information to for this audit, enough information for this audit.
Okay, and
Okay.
now this audit is already posted on the parish government's website
Yes,
under
yes, sir,
the
I did.
Internal Audit Department.
Yep.
Okay. And I don't know, is there anybody that wishes to follow along with this with a copy? Everybody has one? All right. All right, Mr. Duke, proceed.
So basically my conclusions, I found that the port, based on the evidence that I reviewed during this audit, that they are being straightforward with the contracts and agreements, and that they are being transparent with the information that was provided to me and the information that I reviewed. I looked at all this information. I did find some internal control issues that I discussed with the port on several occasions. We had an exit conference, and we had maybe at least three other meetings where we discussed and discussed each one of these recommendations and each one of these findings or observations or conclusions. And I definitely want to thank the port. They were very helpful with this audit. They were very responsive to the meetings that we had. We had some good conversations in their conference room, and some good back and forth conversations on the different findings or observations and recommendations. They were very, very good with that. The COSO control environment, I've talked about that in the past. In 1987, the Committee of Sponsoring Organizations developed a framework for internal controls, that they use to help entities avoid the increase of fraud, waste, and abuse. And this is a framework that is used throughout government as well as throughout corporate America now. It dates back to way back in 1987, and they're still using it to this day. What I would suggest for the port was that the port's control environment, which is basically the tone at the top as well as the framework. If we can take a look at the definition. Control environment is a set of standards, processes, and structures that provide the basis for carrying out internal controls across the organization. The board of directors and senior management establish the tone at the top regarding the importance of internal controls, including the expected standards of conduct. So as we go through this, my review noted that in my opinion, the port's control environment needs some improvement. I go on to state that an inadequate control environment increases the risk of fraud, waste, and abuse. The port does need to pay close attention to their control environment and ensure that these controls are working properly and are in place. The port's top-level management, the tone at the top concerning these internal controls, should ensure that the port's control environment is an important priority. A good and effective control environment will help the port reach their goals and objectives. Top-level management's buy-in concerning the importance of these controls will help the port in the following areas: efficiency and effectiveness of operations, safeguarding assets, integrity of financial information, compliance with contracts, rules, and regulations. As stated in my last part of this conclusion, in my opinion, the internal auditor found that the port is being transparent with these processes. So now we can go on to the observations. Observation number 1, Port Committee, number 15164. And Rule 4C. I'm not going to, like I said, I won't go through the conditions, but if the committee needs additional collaboration or elaboration information on this, we can go and find it in the conditions, or we can find it in my analysis on page 29. It seems like having two meetings, the Port Committee meeting and the Port meeting. Those are two separate meetings. It seems to be redundant to me. So my recommendation, as well as this ordinance, where it states that all related port business and other matters should first be considered by the Port Committee, all related. And it seems to me that's what's being done in the Port Committee. So if we're trying to comply with this ordinance, why are we trying to accomplish the same thing in two meetings? So my recommendation here is either to revise this ordinance, make it more clear, or eliminate the port meeting. And the port has some pretty good suggestions on this. The first one, they do agree that we could review and revise the ordinance number 15164. Management would like to work with the Port Board to develop policies and procedures and have them adopted by the Port Board. They state that these policies and procedures should clearly explain the responsibilities and duties of the Port Committee and the Port Executive staff to demonstrate efficient day-to-day operations. It's good. Management does not agree, though, with the possibility on the option of eliminating the Port Committee for these reasons. Management recognizes the critical role of the Port Committee plays in working with staff to filter items filter what items are relevant that they bring to the Port Board. Port Committee should be a tool to ensure that the board and the staff are efficiently executing policies and procedures of the port. Items presented by the board can take 3 to 5 months for completion. I think that's something good to point out. The committee aids management by deliberating items, issues, or questions regarding port items that are required to be voted on and those items that do require voting. In the process of reviewing Ordinance 15161, the staff and board should examine processes of other major ports along the Mississippi River, and that's a good idea as well. I think these responses are very good, and we'll have to, if the committee has anything to
let me ask you
add
this,
to that.
Mr. Duke. We have one Port Committee member here, and I've talked to a couple of the Port Committee members, and it seems that the Port Committee is there in theory only, and that the chairman, is basically the only one involved in the discussions and the issues, and the Port Committee itself is not utilized to vet issues. And that is a lacking of the Port Committee's involvement from the port side that I see lacking, and not allowing the committee to function as it should function.
Right.
And I'll let Ms. Trufant Ms. Audrey talk about that if she'd like, but that's my experience with the committee.
Well, it's interesting because when we take a look at Rule 4C, when we start talking about the port chairman really doesn't have any authority.
And Mr. Duke, if I could stop you right there, and I think that's the main concern of the Port Committee, and it has been, and I know it's a big concern for me for many years, that it has been established that the port chairperson is the governing authority. It stops there because the communication between the port and the actual council is only between the port staff and the chairman. And I because if you notice, you go back and look at any of the agenda, all of the legislation is presented by the port chairman. Why is that? That's too much, in my opinion, too much, because that's where the communication stops. All of the legislation that's forthcoming is done between the port, the staff, and the chairperson. And usually somewhere along the line, it may get passed off to the port committee members, if you be lucky to stumble across it or whatever, So I'm not here to try to knock anybody, but I'm just trying to get to an efficient,
Yes, ma'am.
way of operating. So
I kind of agree with what you're saying, because it seems to me that the port meeting seems like they have the full council present at the port meeting. So why would we have to, it just seems redundant to me. The more I read over this and looked at all the minutes and everything, it just seemed like, hey, this doesn't make any sense to me. Why not just eliminate the port meeting and have one meeting? Just seems like it'd be more efficient.
And just as a follow-up to that, the port committee, to me, hasn't functioned as it was intended to do. When you mentioned it vets the issues, I've talked to committee members who learn about the issues as we learn about them at the full the full port council meeting. And so when you have half of the committee at least saying that, you know that the function of the committee is not operating properly. And I understand the intention of the committee is to vet issues, but my displeasure with that process is that the rest of the council port body never knows what they discard. So the vetting process is one that eliminates and takes out information that the full body should be recognizing and making a decision on whether or not to discard that information or to accept that information. And when you have that happening, then you get back to no oversight.
That's what I was about to say. It seems to me that you would have better oversight by just having the port meeting. It seems because everybody's there. And if you look at the rule says that all related port business should be handled by the port committee, which is not being done. So the rule itself, or the ordinance itself, is not working properly.
I agree.
Thank you.
So if we take a look at contracts over 50,000, the first observation for those is the Mariner Group, LLC. So there again, we can take a look at the background and conditions if the committee wants additional information. So let's take a look at the recommendations. Consider hiring an in-house grant administrator. The questions for grants can be answered as they arise in a quicker manner. Consider hiring an in-house attorney so the questions can be handled in a quicker manner, especially with concerns of legal review of contracts. For the legal review of contracts, pay attention to the Louisiana State Legislative Auditor's best practice, as well as the port's policies, which state basically similar controls. Before any contract can be executed, the contract must be reviewed by legal counsel and recommended for approval in writing and presented to the board for approval and documented in the minutes. I suggested a legal requirement checklist should be prepared, signed by legal in the port, and attached to the contract. I suggest that a policy contract requirement checklist should be prepared and signed by the person responsible and attached to the contract. Ensure that separate individuals sign, date, and witness the contract. Ensure that liability insurance certificates are current. Any questions regarding that observation?
Management's response is? I'm looking at the response, and it says that the port agrees that hiring an
Oh, sorry about that. I should have.
grant administrator and an in-house attorney, in addition to the current external counsel, would strengthen the port's internal controls over the administration of grants.
Yeah, my bad. I didn't read.
But my point is this: they're willing to add more in-house people, but they're not willing to cut the ties to outside counsel. So I don't know what the benefit would be to load the payroll up and still pay outside counsel.
Yeah, there may not be any financial benefit to that. The cost benefit may be too high, having 2 extra employees. However, the outside attorney, at this point in time, when I was doing the audit, was not providing proper documentation for the review of the contracts before they were executed. And so I'm trying to fix that situation because, I'm hoping that maybe they can fix that. But it just appears that that is not being done by the outside counsel. So I was thinking that maybe if we had an inside person, they might be able to get rid of him, not get rid of him, or just replace him with an in-house counsel might be the best way to go, in my opinion. It'd probably be a lot more cost effective that way. However, he does have institutional knowledge that may be hard to replace, but the in-house attorney could be experienced and possibly gather that information to make up for the cost.
And that brings to mind, early on when I was making comments about the attorney outside, I did raise issues and was concerned that we were paying the attorney to review agendas and those type of things, which were something that I thought that could have been done in-house. But, when I saw those billings to somebody to prepare and review an agenda, this was a couple of years back, it did raise some issues, and your comments make me think back about an in-house attorney, how that would have helped prepare the agenda and the ordinances and those type of things without having to call an outside attorney and pay him $250 or $300 an hour or whatever we pay him. Makes me kind of wonder when we use the staff in the council office to prepare agendas, who have done that for many, many years, as well as preparing ordinances, and they do an excellent job. So it just brought to mind.
Analysis would probably show that it would be cost beneficial to have in-house employees. I can tell you at the Port of New Orleans, Port of New Orleans, they never had any outside counsel. Everybody was in-house, and it worked very, very well for them, especially with grants. Grants are very important. I really don't understand why we'd be outsourcing the grant function. That really should be in-house.
I'm going to leave my remarks at that because I would say something about best practices and when you use them and when you don't use them, but I'll just leave it at that. Thank you.
You're welcome. Let me read over the management response there. I don't know why I overlooked it. Management does agree with hiring the in-house grant administrator and in-house attorney, in addition to the current external counsel, which strengthen the port's internal controls over the administration of grants. The port will submit its consideration to the board. The port is also in agreement with the internal auditor's recommendations. They prepare a legal requirement checklist to attach to the contract. And they will ensure that separate individuals sign, date, and witness the contract, and liability insurance certificates will be current. And we've discussed this, the port and I have discussed all this information and these issues, and these are fixes that they can make. And as I've read through their comments, they they are in total agreement, as we'll see as we go along, with fixing these control issues. I just want to make sure that we all see that. Trident Holdings Incorporated, that's a lot of information on that. We can scroll down to the recommendations. And a lot of these, as I was reviewing all of these contracts, it has to be noted that a lot of the same control issues were for every single one of these contracts, as you will see. It was redundant. Things like the legal review. It happened throughout all of my review of all the contracts. The legal requirement checklist, the legal requirement, contract checklist, ensuring that they have a competitive bid. So that tells me that the controls for one contract that were going wrong for every contract. So there's nothing nefarious going on here. That's what it tells me, because it's very consistent throughout the whole review. Just want to mention that. The consultant's invoices and timesheets should have more itemized detail and explanation. Work order or task order could be attached to the timesheet to support consultant's time billed. The timesheet should be signed and dated by the consultant, indicating that the information is valid and accurate. Consultant's mileage expenses should be supported by a MapQuest or some other external document. Ensure insurance certifications are current, liability insurance. And this is something I just want to mention too. When I was working with Jefferson Parish, this is something that seems like it happens with every department that has the custodianship of contracts. It just seems like they just wait until somebody tells them to get a current certificate. Now, I'm not sure, why that is. I guess they just don't notice it, but I had to fix that at Jefferson Parish, so it seems like, when I saw this, I wasn't surprised. It has to be fixed here as well. For the legal review of contracts, and this is, I just have to make sure, and we discussed this in our meetings with the port. This is very crucial that we make sure that we have a legal review of every single contract before that contract is executed. The legislative auditors, they hit this every single time, and this is a finding, normally a big finding for them if they find this issue. So I just want to make sure, and I've discussed it with the port, how important this is to make sure this is fixed. The checklist should be prepared. Now, this particular contract, I noted that the competitive bid happened way back in 2011. So I noted that the competitive bid appeared to be outdated, and it was outdated. So what we need to do here is make sure that in those cases, we have to make sure that the bid is current, competitive bid is current, at least every 2 or 3 years. You have to, redo it and make sure you are being cost effective and choosing the best vendor for the project, and to ensure that it's an arm's length transaction and that there's nothing going on there, and it's clear that there's nothing going on with that vendor, the choosing of that vendor. Policy requirement checklist, ensure task orders are signed and dated by the consultant and the port is required by the contract. Management states that they will request more itemized details, explanation for time billed. Port recognizes the need for a competitive atmosphere, as we all discussed in our port meetings, and they are very serious about making sure they show the documentation that there is going to be a competitive atmosphere prior to the renewal. Legal requirement checklist. They're going to implement that. Observation number 4, Intermat LLC.
Before we go to that, I'm looking at some of the comments in here. So we actually have contracts or task orders that are not signed?
Yes. Yes, that's correct.
Does the outside contractor check all that? The outside lawyer, does he go over all that?
I was more concerned with just him reviewing. I didn't go over that with him, reviewing the contract. And it looks like there was emails going back and forth with the, outside counsel. But some of the emails were dated after the contract was executed, which we can't have. Some of the emails were they didn't really state by the outside. He didn't state that, yes, I reviewed this contract and everything's okay.
But the review or the correspondence shows that it was after the contract?
Yeah, in the Trident contract, it was after. The emails were after the contract was executed. Internet LLC, there again, we'll make sure that the executive director signs and dates all the contracts. In a few instances, I noted that he didn't date the contract, and you have to have that as an execution of the contract. You have to have the contract dated. So I'm not sure why that happened, but we need to fix that. He needs to make sure he signs it, make sure that we do have a witness signing it, and make sure the executive director, in one instance I found the executive director and the vendor signed the contract, and they signed it also as witnesses. Can't have that. And sometimes they didn't date the contract. You have to have an executed contract, or you don't know when they executed it. Consultants' invoices and timesheets should show more detailed information. Timesheets should be signed and dated by the consultant, definitely by the consultant. He's got to put some responsibility on the consultant, make him sign off on it, make him date it, stating that the work he's done and described there, he's stating it's accurate and it's correct. So if we have a lawsuit, he's on the line for that if something is found where, he's put something on there that's incorrect. Work order, task order should be attached to the timesheet to support the consultant's time billed. The MapQuest needs to be there. Certificates, again, need to be current. Need to pay attention to the legal review, make sure we have that in place. We don't want the legislative auditors, anybody outside coming in here and findings, any of this stuff, really. We don't want them because they are going to make a bigger deal out of it than you can imagine. And not that it isn't a big deal, it is. It's a big deal for us too, but we would rather, just make sure if they do come out that everything's fixed. Legal requirement checklist, the policy checklist. Management response. Management understands that some emails do not clearly indicate legal counsel approval. Legal approval may have come by the way of verbal communications by telephone. The emails do indicate that the port works with legal counsel prior to execution of the contracts. The port will be implementing additional procedures to ensure that the review is documented. Legal requirement checklists and policy requirement checklists will be implemented. Contracts under, any questions about that contract? Sorry.
No good. Any questions?
No.
Contracts under $50,000. This is an area where the executive director has a whole lot of control, as we all know. He can sign off on these contracts without it going before the council. I find that to be a little disconcerting. What I'd like to see, since the council has implemented ordinances for contracts over $50,000, they clearly say that you have to do this, you have to do that for these contracts. I'd like to see the council have an ordinance saying that the port's contracts under $50,000 need to have some policies and procedures in place that will give the council a little more oversight over this, over the $50,000 or less. In other words, I think the full council should review all of these contracts, all $50,000 or less, and make their opinion on these contracts. But I do think it needs to be stated in probably a resolution, maybe it doesn't need to be an ordinance, maybe just a resolution. But it needs to be stated that all contracts need to have a second review, not just a review by the executive director and let that contract fly.
Yeah, I think it's a wonderful idea. And what I think, I'm sorry, Kim, and I would ask that you make a reminder to one of the port committees of that. And whereas we have a reminder that we can have a resolution drawn up.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay?
And to follow up on that, I tend to agree because we got into quite a discussion a while back when we didn't find out about a certain contract that had been signed like 6 months before. And when they ran out of the $50,000, they came back wanting to get more money to continue the contract. And that caused some dissension between the port administration and myself, for sure, because of the fact that we had agreed that that contract or that vendor was not going to be renewed under a previous contract because they worked as a sub. And so when we learned of this, it did create some problems with who communicated with who. And that was an issue for me. And I remember that quite clearly, that it was not very transparent at the time. Even though your comments say that they're very transparent, there are issues that have come to us that we learned after the fact, like months.
Right. Yeah, my statement about transparency only revolves around what I reviewed during this audit.
I understand. Thank you.
I think that's a miscommunication with the committee chairman. That's why we're going to have to just let the whole port control it, because the committee chairman gives them permission to do certain things.
And Rule 4C, as Ms. Savant and I were talking about, the committee chairman doesn't have that kind of power without getting it from the full council. He cannot act as though he's got total authority to act without the council's permission. That rule clearly states that he can't do that, in my opinion, when I read it anyway.
Yes, and definitely this is the way the port has been operating, and I've really had issues with it for some time now. Even before this current council sitting there, it was like everything goes through the port chairman and it's negotiated, and everything is done, is vetted right there. By the time then it's presented. Time after it presented to the full council, but they have already acted on it prior to the full council being informed.
And that's one of the reasons why I really think the port committee should be eliminated. That's a perfect example.
I agree. But then to elaborate a little on that, I think if I remember clearly, I think Mr. Sanders had issues with that because it was the effectiveness of moving 50,000 and less contract. I think that's what his position, if somebody probably could help me out. But I think Mr. Sanders was saying that if he have to wait until he meet the full council, that would hinder his effectiveness in his every day-to-day operation.
And I think that's going to be his argument.
Yeah.
And let me follow up on that, because that's just a red herring.
Yeah.
Because a simple introduction takes 2 weeks. Now, we have seen many times to where the port administration didn't have everything in line for action and delayed weeks and weeks and weeks. But to use the fact that the council action would hinder or would slow down the work process is totally false. Because if they are ready to move, an introduction can be done today and in 2 weeks can be adopted. So, I've heard that argument for some time now about we need the committee to expedite the process, when I find that the committee does not expedite the process. It exasperates the process because of the lack of communication with the board. And we're back to where we have a committee chairman making decisions without ever coming to the full body.
Yeah, according to the rule, that's not the way the rule's supposed. That's the reason that, yeah, it was so confusing to me when I read that rule because it didn't make any sense. And so,
And what I'm doing, and I agree with you, Mr. Chairman, but I was only stating it'll for Mr. Duke's purposes to see to state how we arrive at this point. That's the reason we are where we are. But I totally agree with what Mr. Russo just stated. You know, because even that you even have the avenue of calling a special board meeting. You know, if need be. So it's
and that would be another alternative.
Yes.
And believe me, this council has done everything it can possibly do to facilitate every project and every need that this port has asked for. So there should be no concern that anybody sitting at this table, when it's the full body, would do anything to hamper that. And the proof is the fact that we have, as was shown at the last PAB meeting, the $19 billion worth of projects that are in the queue. And if you go back and look at the voting history of what got those projects to the queue, you haven't seen any opposition by this board. So I would hope that we can be more transparent moving forward with having the issues come before us in a timely manner that the port is prepared for us to vote on.
Right.
Anyway, that's what I've observed. And what that would do, as far as my involvement, it would give me some relief to know that I know what's going on before I have to vote on something at the last minute. And that brings me back to the last contract that we did for Tallgrass. There was a lot of information around about, I was going to be the obstacle, and I'm getting back into the previous 2 weeks. I was going to be an obstacle to this project. And because I was vetting the contract at the last week, trying to get the information about the pilot program, who was going to be on first base, so to speak, they even went through the expense of putting out a political mailer on me, anonymously, saying that I was an obstructionist to the port, which is totally false, and which the cowards that put that mailer out should have waited till they come to the council meeting a couple of days later and saw that I was an advocate for the project and voted for the project. All I was asking for was clarity on what was going on in the contract that we hadn't seen. So I'm getting too far off the field, but that's the point that that would make a lot easier for me to understand what they're doing up front.
I really think you are correct, and I do think it would be better oversight if we just had the one meeting, much better oversight, and I think that would make everybody much more comfortable with what's going on with these contracts.
It would definitely,
as well as other business as well, but focusing on the contracts. Contracts are a big item. It's really, really a big item.
yes.
Comment. Good morning. I was going to hold off until he got finished with all the observations, but I think this is, since we brought up the committee again, a good time to just state a couple of comments on our audit. I think this was an awesome audit. I really enjoyed it. Mr. Duke really highlighted some important things, areas of improvement that we needed to do in the finance department on my end. So my comment on the port committee, as a committee, an audit committee, we all know that it is necessary and it's beneficial to have a committee. The port strongly agrees that the procedures and the way things have been going with the committee and how it has been functioning is not the most effective way, and it definitely needs improvement. So we totally agree with that. As far as eliminating the port committee, as we stated earlier, that would only have one meeting a month, and it would put a time constraint on certain items. And if we had a policy and procedures that really laid out the functions of the committee and the responsibilities and duties that each one of us held in that in that position, then I think the committee could run and be more effectively if it was ran with, in the correct manner. And I wanted to make a comment on the legal review. As Mr. Duke stated, we had much communication with our legal counsel when it came to the contracts. We did not have a lot of, there was communication, but as far as documentation, I would say we were guilty of that. As far as having that solid confirmation that states, yes, I reviewed this contract, yes, it's approved. A couple of the contracts that he mentioned actually came to the board for vote. The few that we mentioned that were over $50,000, because that's what's required by policy. So the board did have a chance to review those contracts, and they were approved. As you all know, previously the port was under a cap on our legal. I don't want to make excuses, but I will say this. In the past, we have held back from seeking legal counsel with the cap in mind on some items. Some items, it was kind of brought to us like, try to take care of it in-house. You know what I'm saying? Because of the cap, be mindful and monitor the spending. So I think that played a major part in some of the items when it was smaller contracts, whether or not we really pushed and seeked more time on legal. I will say I feel like since we've done the travel audit and over the last couple of months, our communication with the board has increased, the entire board, the full board. So I think we are really moving forward and with improvement on, again, transparency and communication, not only with the committees, but the entire board as well. And got to conclude, and then if y'all had any other questions after we finished.
Yes, I have one.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, you mentioned some time constraints on that the reasoning why it would have a negative impact on a port committee. What are some of the time constraints that you're referring to?
Well, I know Mr. Roussel mentioned if we introduce something and then it could be voted on in 2 weeks. That is correct. But at this time, we only have one board meeting. So if I fully agree. I think if the committee is going to be eliminated, then we need to go back to 2 meetings a month. I think that's where the committee came in play, and then we went to 1 meeting. So we've, over the last few years, we've made a lot of changes with the committee, and I think if we keep working with it, eventually we can have it at its efficient. When this board first came in, we did away with it, and then we eliminated it, and I had that conversation with Mr. Duke. For a year we didn't have it, and then for a year we did have it, and now it's like we're working it and we're trying to get it right, and and I think it's a work in progress. I think it does have benefits. I think it has a lot of benefits to having a committee, but it has to be structured properly.
Okay, but I'm still trying to have a problem with how would you have a problem, and why would the constraints affect a regular meeting every 2 weeks?
Well, we don't have a board meeting every 2 weeks because of the committee.
Because of the committee, but
correct.
What I'm saying, if we go to a full council,
if we had 2 meetings, then I'm sure that would be an option to run effectively. If you don't want to have 2 meetings, then I would say keep the committee.
Yeah, I think that's the recommendation of Mr. Duke to go under the full council, which would be every 2 weeks.
Right. Well, right. Eliminate the port committee, and I'm like, wait, I think we need to have 2 meetings, whether it's a committee and a board or 2 boards, but there definitely needs to be 2 meetings. And also the comment on the contracts under 50, we have it in our policy that, yes, the executive director under 50 is allowed to enter into contracts. I think we should be mindful of that as well. Like you said, Mr. Sanders did have a concern with the timing on the smaller issues as well, and whether or not, we put the right policy in place, or we're going to be coming to the board and waiting a month to hire janitor services, for instance, or, those smaller ticket items. So.
You finished, Mr.?
Yeah, I'm finished.
Let me just comment on that. I understand, first of all, let me thank you for your cooperation on this port audit and your knowledge, your acknowledgement of the improvements that are needed. I mean, that's a huge step for us to be going in the right direction. And I want to thank the administration over there for facilitating Mr. Duke and understanding each role. However, on the issue about only one meeting a month or 2 meetings a month and the committee, there should be no concern about meeting twice a month because we do it anyway. The council meets twice a month, and to have a port meeting at the same meeting like we've been doing for many, many years should not be an issue unless you just don't want to have the transparency that I'm requesting that we have. Because everything that is done is published and discussed every 2 weeks. Now, if the port is so concerned about time frames and how we get things done quickly and efficiently, they should be jumping on the fact that we would have 2 full board meetings a month, because the committee cannot function and do anything that obligates the port to do a contract or anything. All they do is review. Now, what has happened, unfortunately, is that maybe the chairman has given direction to the port staff and done things, but it hasn't had the oversight of the full board. So anything that requires oversight of the full board has to come to us anyway. So to think that we are not willing to work 2 days a month, is perplexing to me. So that's why I think we've had, and I keep going back to the full members, when you've had some of the members not even engaged in the process that goes forward before it ever gets to the committee. And then when you get to the committee, you still have to wait to come to the full board. So I think that it's not too much to ask to have 2 meetings a month.
I agree, Mr. Roussel. Like I stated, we have functioned without a committee, and we have functioned with the committee. And like Mr. Duke said, the tone at the top is very essential to the internal controls, and the tone at the top includes the board and the management. So I feel, as long as we communicate and we're on the same page and we all understand what our responsibilities and duties are and whatever procedure we decide to go with, I think as long as that understanding is there, we won't have an issue, or at least we can keep moving forward to improvement.
I also say that y'all have to cooperate with us also. And if you want to, like he said, if you want a meeting twice a month, we there. That's why we there. That's why a full board would be better than a committee. And I'd appreciate if you go back and you tell Mr. Sanders and Mr. Matthews.
I will. And, I'm sure they will consider your comment, and at the same time, we don't have the power to eliminate it or have it. So, we just want to make sure that we're working towards the same goals.
I would say that we are just having an open discussion, Ms. Chambreau, and the thing that I can say personally is I am a sitting port committee member, and for me personally, it's as though, as I said earlier, legislation issues are presented to the port chairman, okay? By the time it's disseminated to myself and the other committee members, it has already been vetted. It's been pointed in a certain direction. There have been certain council members have been informed, others haven't been informed. And there's time it caused contention between myself and the port staff, because then I'm receiving phone calls, and what I've been forced to do is ignore the phone calls and force the issue to come before a full council, because if you're going to engage me individually, I prefer it be on record, where it's in an open and full meeting. And, so some of these things could be eliminated if everything comes to the full port council board. and that's all we trying to get to, a more effective way of doing things. And I'm just sharing with you my personal experience. And, and a lot of times I don't like finding myself in a position that I'm in, because it's like almost, okay, you're anti, you're against. But no, I'm more comfortable in operating like this in a public meeting where it's getting to everybody at the same time. But then you are giving it to 2 or 3 council members and a port committee member ahead of time. You've already decided the direction that you want to take the legislation in. Then it come to us. I'm uncomfortable with that. So these are some of the things that I would like to see change and address.
We'll take note.
Thank you, Ms. Jambrow. Mr. Duke?
Yeah, let's take a look at the Aries contract, observation number 6. Yeah, by the way, the contract's under 50,000. I think we went over management's response to that. I'm going to make sure management, the port currently has a policy in place, like Ms. Williams has stated, for 50,000 or less. The procedures for the contracts are listed on a flow chart. The port adopted this policy in 2017. Management recommends that the executive director announce any new signing of contracts below 50,000 at the board meeting following execution, and email these documents to the entire board. That is the port's response to that. Let's take a look at this contract called Aries Security Corporation, doing business as the Marina Group LLC. This contract, the port and I discussed this contract, and we looked at it in depth, and we both came to the agreement that this really should never have been a contract, should not have been an agreement. It should have been an addendum to observation number 2, the Mariner contract. It would have played out a whole lot better for everybody. So that being said, we can take a look at this contract. There's a few things I want to point out on it. And of course, let's read over the response from management first. Then I'll point out some things that I think I need to point out to the committee. The port was awarded this grant in 2016. That's referring to observation number 2, the Mariner contract. That was a federal grant contract. It was for cybersecurity. The agreement with Aries referenced in the observation number 6, which is this observation, is for ongoing software maintenance and support. The agreement is not for professional services. I agree with that. It's a consulting contract. That's the way it is now. The agreement was to pay Aries for the software upgrades and continuous support. The main purpose was to modify and update software application and delivery. The agreement should not have been included in the contract list or the population in itself. Had it been an addendum to observation number 2 and included as that part of that contract, it wouldn't have been in the population. Therefore, I wouldn't have chosen it in my sample. But let's take a look at this contract itself. I've got it on the, and if you take a look at it, it's really a very deficient instrument. It's just to let the committee understand why it shouldn't have been a contract or an agreement, because it's just so deficient. Is pleased to present the contract. It states the contract to the port for cybersecurity assessment. You see, Aries Security Corporation is the parent company of Mariner Group. They are the parent of Mariner Group, and Mariner Group is subsidiary. So what we have here is a contract where all they lay out is just the payment of 1 through 12 and the amount and the due date. That's all they do. And then they state that the thing that really got me with this was that this contract is a significant savings over the previous agreement, monthly fee of $6,242.42 a month. Okay, but the contract will auto-renew for an additional 12 months at previous agreement a monthly fee of that amount. And this contract was under the $50,000 amount. It came out, I believe, at $49,900. Okay? And so it was under it. So it just kind of is like a funky transaction. So that being said, let's go back to my my deal here, and basically I read over the and it's probably a good thing that that I did review it and bring it to the committee's attention, even though I do agree with the port. This type of contract probably should not have been listed in the population of contracts at all, and it definitely should have been brought to the full council for review. Vickermans and Associates. I found that during my review of Vickermans, I found when I was reading over their timesheets, compared to these other contracts, I found Vickerman to be very detailed with the preparation of what they did and listed in their timesheets. And in fact, they're the only vendor that signed off on their timesheets. They didn't date it, but they signed off on it, stating that, this is accurate. Or at least that's what the signature normally states, that they believe that the information on the timesheet is accurate and valid. So my recommendations with this, just make sure, here we go again, a lot of these recommendations are very consistent from one contract to another. I want to point that out. So, when we talk about a control breakdown in one contract and it's consistent throughout all contracts, even though it's a breakdown in controls, it's still a good thing, because you know that those particular contracts should be breaking down. They break down on one contract, they should be breaking down on all the contracts. And if they're not, then you're kind of wondering why that's not happening. And there could be something odd happening. The agreement should be signed and dated by 2 witnesses. The agreement should include the required contract content, the policy that Port has as far as required content, which states they should have a signability clause, anti-discrimination language. That should definitely be in all contracts. Actually, the Port policies are really good, and all of those port policies that they have, required port policies, should be listed in every single contract. And if the attorney's reviewing that, they should make sure and ensure that all of that is in there. And they should state that in, I think, in a checklist that's attached to the contract, a legal requirement checklist. Policy contract requirement checklist, legal review, you have to do that. You have to make sure that's done. The requirement checklist, make sure that all port policies are followed. There's nothing missing in the contract. If something is missing, make sure that's documented as to why it's missing, and have the legal counsel sign off on it and date it. Make sure that he's liable for what is going on with the review of these contracts, and make sure that he states that he has reviewed them, so that if anything goes wrong with these contracts, he's the one that's going to be on line for it. Pay attention to the 50,000 or less. Legislative auditors state that contracts 50,000 or less do not fall under the public bid law. However, they do state that best practice states that even though it doesn't require, a public bid, the competitive atmosphere still should be in place, and that, therefore, management should use a dollar threshold contained in the public bid law as a guide for contracting services for less than 50,000. At least 3 telephone Quotations to be obtained between 10,000 and 30. Bids should be solicited and obtained for purchases of services exceeding 30,000. Any exception to this policy should be approved by the board and council in open meeting. Port should pay all invoices on time. There was just an incident where a couple of invoices were paid past the 30-day limit, and the port had to pay a penalty fee. And I think Ms. Chambrell has, Ms. Williams has stated the reason for that. V&A timesheets should be signed and dated. Travel expense reports should be signed, dated. Receipts for meals should show the detail of the items purchased, the business purpose, identify the person or persons that made the purchase. All that should be on any indirect expense. A legal management response is a legal requirement checklist. A policy contract requirement checklist should be implemented. They're going to do that. The port is going to do that. Management did not pay the invoices in a timely manner due to a risk exceeding the 50,000 contract limit. Payments were made while the contract was being discussed with the port committee and the port board. The port currently has a policy that does not require bids for contracts less than 50,000. The port will continue to create a competitive atmosphere when applicable and cost-benefit efficiency. Acknowledgement of time and travel connected to parties will be added to their policy. Any questions on this Vickerman contract? If not, I'll go to observation number 8. Gary LaGrange and Associates, LLC. Take a look at my recommendations. The agreement should clearly state and define the services that the consultant will provide to the port on an as-needed basis. I found this to be, when I read this contract, I found it to be a little bit lacking. The agreement should be signed and dated by the consultant and port executive director. You have to do that, make sure they do that. Witness signatures and dates. Policies, port policies should be followed, and the lawyer should catch this if they're not in the contract, such as assignability clause and anti-discrimination language. Policy requirement checklist, of course. Now, I did find a situation where I found that consultants' invoices, weren't exactly correct in what we paid this particular vendor. I think it was off by half an hour. So the consultant invoice hours should be compared to the consultant's expense report hours, and they should match. The consultant should only be paid for the hours actually worked. The consultant's expense report or timesheet should be signed and dated by the consultant. When dealing with contracts, pay attention to the appearance of a business transaction where there is or was a close relationship. And I do want to move just a little forward just to make sure we have a little information on that, why I'm saying that. And if we take a look at Grange and Associates, and I'm not saying there's anything nefarious going on here, but it was noted that Mr. Gary LaGrange was the chief executive officer of the Port of New Orleans until his retirement in April 2017. The deputy port director of Plaquemines Port worked for him at the Port of New Orleans. The deputy port director's hire date with the port was May 1st, 2017. The agreement with LaGrange and Associates was entered into on June 1st, 2018. It does appear that LaGrange and Associates, because I am familiar and I did some research on Mr. LaGrange, it does appear that he has, and he's had a lot of port experience, so he is qualified and experienced to perform this work. There doesn't appear to be any compliance or legal issues with this transaction. However, we need to make sure that the documentation clearly shows that this was an arm's length transaction. And so I just wanted to make sure the committee has that bit of information when I talk about situation. Let's see. Pay close attention, make sure contracts are arm-length transactions, that when dealing with contracts, pay attention to the appearance of a business transaction where there is a close relationship. That should just, that probably, should be brought up by the council if they see this again. Any type of situation like this, they see it. When dealing with contracts, pay attention to the best practice which states that contracts with a related party. This is not I'm not saying this is a related party transaction because I don't believe it is, but I'm just saying let's make sure that that we pay attention that if there is any inkling of a related party transaction that it is strictly prohibited. Legal review, the requirement checklist, and contracts less than $50,000. Try to get 3 telephone quotations, and if it's between $10,000 and $30,000, and bids should be solicited and obtained for purchases exceeding $30,000, and that brought to the council for approval in an open meeting. Port policy prohibits related port transactions, party transactions. This is management's response. A legal and policy requirement checklist will ensure port follows the internal auditor's recommendations. The agreement did have clearly defined services. Attached to the contract, the services were defined as identified shippers and owners of cargo, as well as potential carriers and terminal operators. Okay, so that takes care of Mr. LaGrange. Is there any questions on that contract?
Just that it seems to be the same lack of signatures and documentation throughout.
If we take a look at this as a whole, you have a lot of, breakdown and signatures, dates, best practice, the legal review, items of that nature. I felt like I could have done a summary probably on all of these contracts as a whole, but I decided to do each individual one, and even though it appears to be redundant, I just felt like I needed to go through each contract with the committee. I might handle this type of audit write it up a little differently in the future. Pritall LLC is a consulting contract. Recommendations ensure professional education and business qualification and experience in the areas of marketing, public relations, government relations are submitted and considered and reviewed. Ensure the contract states a maximum amount and an end date or a period of time. The agreement should state the work to be performed, including goals, objectives. The agreement should state a termination clause, remedies for default, anti-discrimination clause. Should be signed and dated by witnesses. The agreement should be dated by Port's executive director and the owner of Pritall. There should be evidence of current insurance coverage and legal review. And those are the items that we can see from contract to contract. The best practice, even though it's not a legal requirement, legislative auditors does feel that everything should have a competitive atmosphere, even contracts less than $50,000. I have a tendency to agree with that. I like to have a competitive atmosphere on all contracts, at least, below $10,000, at least 3 telephone calls. A legal policy management's response, a legal policy requirement checklist will ensure that the port follows the auditor's recommendations. Upon renewal of the contracts, the port will ensure competitive atmosphere. And Ms. Williams and Mr. Matthews, we discussed this at length, and they feel the same way about the need for this these controls to be in place.
Okay, so in this particular instance, did it appear that it was just a random contract that was given to someone? It was no competitive bid. It was no, he didn't meet the
Well, there's
qualifications?
no proof of that. So basically, this contract, since it's $50,000 or less, doesn't have to be bid out. But I do highly recommend
But
that
but all others, you recommended the phone calls?
yeah, I
you made.
recommend those phone calls.
Yes.
But they're, none of these 50,000 or less did that. Complied with the best practice for the Louisiana legislature. They didn't do that. They didn't get the 3 calls. They didn't bid 50,000 or less because their policy says they don't have to do it.
Yeah. Okay, but I don't want to go as far as saying these buddy contracts being handed out, but then it leaves suspect that, if the person, even if you're not making the calls, but then for you as an auditor to indicate that it was no qualification or experience in the area that they were being paid for.
Right. I did not see, there was a lot of issues with this contract, I agree. But I didn't find, anything nefarious about it. I just found some control issues that should have been in place that could have made the contract more solid and a lot better. I think all contracts, have to have, certain items in it. And I do point out that this contract didn't have, I couldn't find, where they had the business qualifications and experience. And so that's the reason I didn't find that is because they didn't do any type of bid process on it because it's a 50,000 or less contract. Had they have to bid it out or get, 3 bids by phone or something, then they would have had these qualifications in place.
Okay, well, I'm looking down at the management response. They have agreed to do a competitive to create a competitive atmosphere in the future, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Now, they haven't stated in this response that they were going to do, but I'm sure Ms. Williams can opine on this, if they're going to comply with the best practice or not. But I would highly recommend that they comply with best practice for contracts 50,000 or less.
Okay.
And, well, there's a little history on this contract, though. When we first came here in 2015, they had a contract for $3,000 a month for this individual. And after 6 months of requesting documentation of work product, they decided to cancel the contract because no work product was ever produced. And then a couple of years later, this seemed to be a compromise of the $100 an hour position to be put in with the other contracts for printing and those type of things. And so this has been something that has been talked about for quite some time, and there have been concerns about issues being raised, and because of the conflict between the $100 an hour job and the public responsibility of providing public information in the press, people have asked, well, does that influence what goes into the paper? And it's definitely a concern that has been raised to me by many people. And so I'm not sure how you get around that conflict of being able to be paid $100 an hour as a consultant to the port and at the same time controlling as the editor of what goes into the paper. And I have seen times where, I didn't agree with what was printed, but I've been told by the individual that when you own the ink, you put what you want in the paper. But at the same time, when we're paying $100 an hour to that consultant, does that represent a fair representation of the public information that should be transmitted to the public, knowing that, your $100 an hour job might be on the line? So having said that, and those are the type of things that come to us, and when we deal with them and air them out, we become branded as anti. Mm-hmm. And when you get that brand for just vetting public concerns, it is annoying.
And I think, the competitive bid process would help what you're saying. If they go through some sort of competitive bid process, bring in other vendors into play here, then, you'll have a choice besides just print all. That's what's happening here. You just have print all to choose from. That's all they're doing because it's 50,000 or less. Okay, but if you go through a bid process and get at least 3, or if it's over 30,000, which this one not sure, I have to go check. If it was over 30,000 for the services, then you have to do a solicited process. And then you're going to have, you're not going to be stuck with just one monopoly, one person to deal with. And so since they're not doing the competitive bid, they're saying, well, this is the only person that's going to be able to do the work for us. And so that's not really a good contract for the council probably to accept because of that. So that is another reason why all of these contracts have to come before the full council and be scrutinized by everybody.
Yeah, I think,
So that we have total oversight over this stuff, and we say, the council says, wait a second, just like what Mr. Roussel says. Look, well, I have these reasons why I don't want this contract. And, that should be hopefully, documented, and it is documented, and that's a good enough reason to nix the contract.
Yeah, Mr. Russell, I thank you for your comments because I think you gave a perfect analogy of what's going on here as far as the press and the actuality. I would hate to, borrow the language of the president, but some of it becomes fake news, because it doesn't really give you a clear picture of what's going on. Either if you're not supportive, if you, as Mr. Roussel is stating now, we're just concerned about the parish. We're just concerned about the issues. But then you could get labeled as you're against the port, you're against Prento, and there you go. And you're labeled, and that's a badge that you have to wear. And it's not fair to the individual for us sitting here as governmental officials trying to do what's best for the parish. And
I agree with you 100%. It's a badge they put on you, and you just can't get rid of it because you become a bad guy. And you're not a bad guy. You're just trying to do the right thing for the people of the parish.
yes.
And it does look like, under management's response, and again, Ms. Williams can opine on this, it does look like they're going to ensure more of a competitive bid atmosphere for 50,000 or less contracts. So, anyway, we'll go on to the last.
We have, Ms.
Regarding the Prento contract, as Mr. Roussel stated, in 2015, we did have a larger contract for $3,000 a month. There was quotes provided for that one. I did not provide that to Mr. Duke because it wasn't concerning this current contract, but for that larger one, we did go out and we had a quote package on file. This current contract, the board did bring about their concerns regarding the Gazette. We did have a meeting and we discussed it at a port board meeting. As we continue with the contract, it is significantly lower than $3,000 a month, and all of the invoices and details behind those are provided to the board every month. So I just wanted to go on record stating that the port has put forth effort in being more transparent and acknowledging the discomfort with the contract.
And let me thank you for that because it does give us a little idea of what is allegedly going on per hour. My concern was the $3,000 a month with no backup information.
Exactly.
And I appreciate you changing and accepting the fact that we do need justification for paying public funds to individuals.
Yes, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chambrell.
The last observation is Prento again, LLC, consulting work and materials and supplies. Ensure again that the contract it shows the qualification and experience of the vendor. The agreement should state the work performed. doesn't make any sense. Okay. Just want to make sure I had this right. A lot of these are very redundant, and it just, I think in the future, anyway, the agreement should include the goals and objectives. Agreement should state remedies for default, discrimination clause dated by the witnesses. The agreement should be dated by the executive director. The current insurance coverage, legal review, again, and the best practice for contracts. I think everything should have a legal bid process, all contracts, including 50,000 or less. Timesheets submitted for marketing and communication work should be signed and dated by the consultant. Payment should only be made based on approved timesheets to support the marketing and communication work. Timesheets should be dated again and signed. This is some cleanup stuff that we, the port and I, hopefully will put in place. The public bid law again, purchases under 10,000, 3 telephone calls over 30,000, a bid process. So management response was a legal and policy requirement checklist will be put in place. Upon renewal of this contract, the port will ensure again a competitive bid process. It seems to me, and through my conversations with the port, they have bought in to all of these recommendations. They bought into, the legal review. They bought into the competitive atmosphere. They're going to make changes, and it seems to me from their responses that they're going to put the controls that are recommended in place.
Excuse me, Mr. Duke, I'm being told you're not being picked up by the audio, so could you move it a little closer to you?
Excuse me. Sorry
Thank
about
you.
that. Thank you, ma'am. So that being said, I do want to again thank Ms. Williams and Mr. Matthews, who's not here today, for, I think, a very cooperative, professional attitude during this audit. We not only had one meeting, one exit conference, but we had probably 4, maybe 5. We discussed this information over and over again, and we had a lot of emails going back and forth. And I again do appreciate their help. They were very, very professional in their dealings with me. So that being said, that's all I have for today.
Well, thank you very much for the presentation. I think you've done an excellent job and a very detailed product here as far as the contracts and audit. I'm very happy to hear that the port is willing to come to the table and correct some of the internal control actions that are needed and that you're recommending. And I thank you, Ms. Williams, for cooperating and being here and understanding that our role here is simply oversight. And as the charter states, we're here to just make sure that everything is operating efficiently and that cooperation like yours is well accepted and well worth the end product that we produce. So, any more comments on this audit item? Hearing none, we can move to the next item on the agenda.
Audits in progress, status of the Water Department internal audit.
I have started the Water Department internal audit. It's ongoing. Conversations with Mr. Giles and Miss Angela Bartholomew. We're working together to get this audit completed as soon as possible.
Good. Well, I'm happy to hear that we're moving forward with the Water Department audit. Anything else anybody has any comments on?
I just would like to say generally that I would like to commend again Mr. Duke for such an amazing job that he's done with parish auditing. I think this is where one of the very few auditors that we've had that been so efficient and have brought us out of the dark ages and up to par. And I would just like to commend you and hope that you can continue doing as great a job as you're doing. As you may know, that 2 of the council members that's setting up here is in a month or 2 we no longer will be here for various reasons, and I just pray to God that you continue the efficiency that you've done with us, with the incoming councilman, and I pray you a lot of luck.
Thank you.
I'll be praying for you,
Thank you
sir.
very much, and
But,
you don't have to worry about that. This is the way I work. And let me say this to both you and Mr. Juneau, you will be missed by me.
I thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And I want to thank the two members of the committee that will be leaving us as well. I think that we have made light years in striding towards trying to make this audit committee a functioning committee and an effective committee, and I think we have done that. And I encourage the public to go to the parish website and look at the product, the work product that has been produced by Mr. Duke and this audit committee. I think it's the first time that you have been able to see an internal audit department function the way that this internal audit department has functioned. And I thank everyone involved for that. If that ends the conversation on that item, we'll move to approval of the minutes.
Approval of the minutes from the October 11, 2018 meeting.
Ms. Sullivan offers. Mr. Juneau seconds. Any comments on the adoption of the October 11, 2018 minutes? Hearing none, machine is open. And the minutes are approved 3-0. There being no further business to come before the audit committee today, I'll entertain a motion to adjourn. Ms. Sullivan moves to adjourn. Mr. Juneau seconds. Machine is open. And the meeting is adjourned today at 11:01. Thank you all for participating.